Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. I'm also a pastor at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, and I'm so grateful to be here with you today. Today on the show, I have the privilege of welcoming Karen Swallow Pryor. Karen has her PhD in British literature, and she was a professor for decades teaching English and literature and writing. And now she reads and writes and speaks all over the country. She's the author of numerous books, and her latest book is entitled You Are Called, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good, and Beautiful. And that's the topic of our conversation today. What does it mean to be called by God to do something? How does that align or come into tension with our American values of finding your passion or doing what you love? Well, if you have ever wondered whether you missed your calling or whether you're still looking for your calling, this is a good conversation for you. Well, welcome to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I have the privilege of having Karen Swallow Pryor on the podcast today. Karen, thanks for being here with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so for our listeners, tell us a little bit about where you live and what you're up to in your day-to-day life right now.
Well, I live in Central Virginia, and I am doing the whole work from home thing and have been for the past couple of years. And my work consists of writing and speaking. And when I speak, obviously, unless I'm on a podcast, I'm not home. So I do spend a bit of time traveling about and speaking about the things that I write. And after almost 25 years full time in the classroom, in the university context, it's been quite a shift, but I'm actually coming to enjoy it a great deal.
Yeah, that is a big change because you were an English professor for most of your career, right?
Yes, I was an English professor and I still do English type things. I write a lot about literature, especially on my Substack. And I've sort of moved my classroom to that space. And the books that I write aren't always directly on literature, but I'm always bringing literature into the way that I think and grapple with the questions in the world.
Yeah, I'm so impressed by your writings because you have a way of just like interweaving classical literature and many other topics together. And I just love that. It's just such a fun, like exciting way to read as a reader, just to follow along. And I'm always like, when I'm reading you, I tend to learn a lot about, different books I haven't read in classical literature, but you just connect them so well to, something theological or something else going on in life. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad you do appreciate it because that's actually how I learned to teach literature, especially to students who I taught a lot of students who were just taking the required classes. And so for me, I wanted to bring literature alive by connecting literature to the real world. And then I guess I do the reverse too. I connect real world questions to great literature.
Yeah, I think it's so helpful. I think the thing about literature that's so, that always meets me, even like as a pastor, is that it just expands my mind constantly for what real life is actually like. Like, it's like, people think of literature or, and fiction as like, not real life, but I think it's often more real than real life, if that makes sense.
It makes so much sense, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, especially in your calling as a pastor, because the first book that I ever wrote, which is sort of like the unknown one, Book to Literature and the Soul of Me, is really about how literature taught me God's truth in ways that I didn't quite get from the Bible. So I was able to sort of live different lives vicariously and see how the truths of God's word remain true when characters stray from truth or stray from morality. And so literature just sort of brought me back to God in that way and helped me understand the things that God's word says, but somehow seemed more real to me in the books of fiction.
So when did you first get interested in kind of this career, this pathway in
Mm.
literature? What was the catapult for that?
Yeah, I mean, I was always a reader from, the time I was a very small girl and loved English classes in school, but even in going to college, I didn't even know being an English major was a thing until
Mm.
I got to college. And so it was in college that I discovered reading that way and studying literature in a serious manner. And so I just went into a PhD program when I finished my undergrad and still wasn't planning on teaching. I just wanted to read and study literature. But in the course of that program, I began teaching and I discovered really what I think God created me to do.
Mm. Oh, that's amazing. I love that. What are some of what were some of your favorite like key books like at that stage as you were kind of like going into the PhD program? What was getting you excited? Those.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in my undergraduate studies, I did make the determination that I loved British literature, not American literature. Um, Probably because of when I was assigned to read Moby Dick. And I still, someday I am going to completely read Moby Dick. I have not done that yet. But so I knew I loved British literature and the novel. And so I did study Old English, Middle English, but then specialized for my dissertation in the 18th and 19th century English novel. And so that's sort of where I planted. But it's a broad range. As what, when one teaches in college, you teach survey classes, a lot of literature, so you get to get exposed to a lot more things. But 18th, 19th century periods and the novel in particular are.
What are some of the authors we would know from that?
Oh, yeah. So the 18th century is a lot of people don't read 18th century, that those are poets like Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson, who's also a
Oh,
literary
okay.
critic. Jonathan Swift, the satirist. I love those guys. Then when we get into the 19th century, we get into the more famous names of the great novelists like Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, George Eliot. So those kinds of folks.
Why do you think there was such a, during the 19th century, such a boom in like English literature? Because I mean, that was just those names are so,
Mm.
they're like household, everyone knows those names.
Mm.
Why was there something going on that like contributed to that, or was that just, just happened?
There was indeed. In fact, I tell this history from a slightly different angle in the evangelical imagination because I think it's easy for us as Americans in the 20th and 21st century to forget that England was once the world's leading empire. And so in the 19th century, Great Britain ruled the globe. It owned or oversaw one quarter of the land mass in across the earth. And it through colonization, basically, as I said, ruled the world. And so at the same time that the British Empire was growing and dominating, its literature was doing the same thing. And so the 19th
Mhm.
century was the peak for the British Empire and the peak in world literature. And also the novel itself, those names that I mentioned, grew prominent in that time because the novel is really an expression of the modern self, and so modernity is growing alongside the British Empire, and the modern self as an autonomous individual, and sort of figuring out how to stake its claim as an individual is developing in literature because that's what was happening in real life. To go back to our
Mm.
earlier conversation, literature really does teach us a lot about real life.
Yeah, yeah. And it strikes me that like authors writing during any time are just being influenced by what's going on around them. Like you can't quite escape that.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a chicken and egg question that can't be answered, but so authors in their role as sort of prophets, and the poets do this even better. They are sort of predicting and seeing where the world is going and writing that, but also reflecting. So it's a cyclical thing that the writers are expressing and even directing the direction that the world is going in. In broad in broad strokes, but even in smaller
Mhm.
ones. So we can look at smaller periods like modernism or Renaissance, or all of the smaller periods in history, and we can see the writers doing that.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I want to talk about your new book. Your latest book is You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good, and Beautiful, which for those listening on audio, you won't be able to see, but you can look it up. I love the cover of this book. My camera's not even showing it quite. Um, but I love this image of, the person in the field kind of looking out over the wildflowers. And is there something particular about that cover that I know sometimes authors don't get to say what the cover is, but was there something special about this to you?
Well, well, I do get a lot of say in the cover, but this cover came completely, at least in its original iteration, from the art designers at Brazos. They gave me
Okay.
several options, and I hated all of them except for this one. And they were very different, and there were lots of ways to, to prepare a cover for a book like this. But this was the one that just immediately caught my attention. And then we spent a couple of weeks tweaking everything from the color of the font to the font itself to the placement of the letters. That's where I get bogged down, is I can be very picky about those things. And I'm so glad you like it. It turned out, I think, beautifully,
Hmm.
and it really reflects the whole spirit of what I'm trying to communicate in the book. So I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. So a book on vocation, what prompted you to write a book? Because this seems like a little bit of a uh, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but a departure from other books you've written, like your other book, The Evangelical Imagination, and now this on vocation. What was the
Mhm.
stepping stone to that?
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I mean, everyone asks me that, like, why did I write on calling and vocation? And it is definitely a departure from my usual shtick, I guess. But there's a sort of a very practical answer that is quick and easy, and then a longer answer that draws on my years of teaching. And the practical one is that I was asked to do a workshop at a Rabbit Room on the Road event on being called to be creative. Was given sort of a topic, or maybe that's the topic I chose, and so I did a talk on how we're all called to be creative. I started giving that talk a couple of other places, and it just kind of grew into a talk on calling, and not just being creative, but really the source of all creativity, the true, good, and beautiful. So it was, it started from a talk, grew into a book. But in writing the book, I am drawing on 25 years of experience or more, actually going back to my years as a private Christian high school principal, 35 years of teaching young people, helping them make decisions about their education and what happens after that, their calling, and then even more recently in my calling as a writer, working with and talking to a lot of writers, especially women writers who are early or mid-career, and a lot of people in all of those contexts facing sort of disappointment and disillusionment that I think stems in large part from having a very unrealistic expectation that's been given to them by the world, by our culture, about what calling and vocation look like.
What are some of the factors of that unrealistic expectation?
Well, they are, so a couple of them that I really press back against in the book. One is the whole idea of pursuing your passion. That's something that now I think a couple of generation of people have been raised with. And there is actually nothing inherently wrong with pursuing your passion. As I say in the book, as human creatures made in God's image, we are made to have desires and passions. And those can be cultivated, by him and through him. They can be cultivated by other things. But even putting that aside, um, it is just a very tiny blip of an exception on the radar of human history that people who work and provide for themselves and their families get to do something that they're passionate about.
Mm,
So it's wonderful if you can, but in this moment in history, there and largely through the influence of social media, there's just this false myth that that's exactly what everyone is supposed to do or should be doing, and if you don't do that, you're somehow a failure.
mm,
And that is a devastating message for most of the people who are not going to, make $1 million pursuing their passion.
yeah.
So that's one big source, I think, of the disappointment and disillusionment. Another one is, in sort of the reverse, is that related to social media and celebrity culture and all those things that make modern life what it is. We have forgotten the um, how so much of what we do in ordinary everyday life is what we're called to do, and it is good and it is true and it is beautiful. And so I've also in the talks that I've given on this topic and in other in speaking especially with aspiring writers, I've encountered a lot of women in their 30s and 40s or even 50s who maybe stayed at home, maybe didn't pursue as much of an education as they now wish that they had, and feel like they somehow missed their calling or are not doing something that's worthy or significant and important, and that could not be further from the truth. A lot of times we can look at our lives, especially as we get toward the second half of them, and look back and see that the things that we were doing that we thought we were just doing because we were supposed to or had to are actually have are things that we've been called to. Those have been our calling. Calling doesn't always look like what social media influences and cable television and self-help books say they look like. And so that's sort of coming from the other end, that there's so much important
Mm.
and significant that people are doing in everyday life, and those are callings and they are worthy and important and valuable.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Um, as I'm thinking about it, it makes me think about, even when you are doing something you're passionate about, like for your work, still many areas of your life will be things that you're not passionate about, and yet you are still called to them. And
Yes.
so is like, how do you talk about like kind of this? Do you talk about like multiple callings in life, or like how would you put that?
Yes, from the outset of the book, I think from page one, I say that we have various callings over the course of our lives. There isn't just one calling. And words are fun. I love words. I'm an English professor, and there are different contexts in which we use words like this. So oftentimes when we're talking about a calling, we are talking about work, we're talking about pay, we're talking about a career. It's very American, very modern, and that is one context in which we should talk about calling. But our roles in families as sons and daughters and mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, those are callings. Our role as a friend is a calling. Our role as a neighbor is a calling. Our role in being a citizen of a particular country in a particular time, that's a calling that brings with it duties and responsibilities, because in God's sovereignty, that's where we were born or live. And so it's a calling to be a citizen of a certain time and place. All of those are callings, and thinking about them and understanding them as callings can change the way we understand our stewardship of them. And also, as you said, help us realize that we're called to many things. That doesn't mean they're all things we're necessarily passionate about, but we are still called to do them and to be good stewards of those roles that God has given us.
Yeah. So how would you define calling? It sounds like there's a spiritual element obviously to it, like God is calling. So
Mhm.
how would you put it?
Yeah, so I can be a very literal person. So a calling is, and by the way, calling and vocation get used interchangeably because they do come from the same word that just it literally means like to vocalize or to call. So a calling is something that draws us and comes to us from outside. And I do distinguish that from passion, which comes from inside. Our passion is inside, a calling comes from outside. So a calling is, it's, I mean, it's almost just like to use a very time-bound metaphor, it's like a phone call, right? Someone calls us, and then we have to decide and hopefully decide rightly whether and how to answer that call. If the call is from God, which is the hardest thing to discern, then obviously we ought to answer that call. And God, usually does not call directly. So he uses people in our lives. He can use our passions and desires. He can use our gifts. He uses our circumstances so that we can discern what God truly is calling us to do. But again, it's not just one thing. It can be multiple things and it can look different. It can change shape over time. And sometimes a calling can end. If you're a child of a parent and that parent dies, then you're calling as a mother or a daughter or son to that person ends. That's an example of one way a calling can end. And yeah, I look at my own circumstance. I'm no longer a professor in the classroom, so I can say that that calling has ended. But at the same time, I'm still a teacher. I will always teach in some fashion. So that calling hasn't ended. But because a call comes from outside, and hopefully we're answering a call that comes from God. It doesn't mean that we always, that it, the calls we get aren't always the ones we want, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I think of dating. Yeah, fortunately, I've been married many, many years, and I'm glad I don't have to do the dating scene today because it sounds not very fun at all. But sometimes if if you might not get the call from the person that you want or you're hoping for, but you get a different call and you find out, oh, that turns out all right, and you pick up that call, and God can use many things. I also say in the book that there is no perfect blueprint for each person's life, that God can use multiple choices and decisions that we make. If they're honoring to him, he will work it all together and help us to find our call, even though we might take different pathways there.
Yeah, so you talk about uh, generally the call, what when you're looking at what is God's call in my life, you give these three categories of the good, the beautiful, and the true.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Why the good, the beautiful, and the true?
Yeah. So, spoiler alert, I do say early in the book that I don't have like a magic formula or six easy steps through which you can find your call. It's not that simple. But the argument I'm basically making, and when I write books, I'm usually trying something else out for myself as a process of exploration and discovery. So here's
Hmm.
my book. Here's my tentative thesis that I turned into a book because I was trying to figure it out. Is my argument is basically that if you pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful, you'll find your calling. And so I have to unpack obviously a little bit about what true, good, and beautiful are, especially in the context of calling. And because those are things that philosophers and artists and creators talk about a lot, usually not in the context of calling. And in philosophy, the true, the good, and the beautiful are called transcendentals. And that means that they are things that need no rationalization or justification. Like no one would argue that truth, goodness, and beauty are bad. I mean, they're just self-evidently good, and we should all strive for them. And as Christians, we know that God is those things and he is the source of them. But even pagan philosophers understood that they are just, they have their own defense. They don't need our defense. They are their goodness is self-evident. And so if we're thinking about those three things, and we start with the true, um, this goes back to some of the things I said about the students that I've taught over the years. We have to recognize what's true about ourselves, our gifts, our call, our abilities, our weaknesses, our strengths, and we have to know what's true about the work. And so I give an example of a high school student that I was offering counsel to who had these wild dreams that she wanted to be an OBGYN and yet couldn't pass her math class and was never going to really do well in math or science. And so that's a simple example of how if you don't have a gift and a talent in an area that's required for a certain kind of work, that's probably not your calling. We have to
Mhm.
face those truths. And so they can be hard truths or we could have multiple gifts and talents and we still have to narrow it down, but we still have to start with the truth about ourselves, the truth about reality, and even sometimes the truth about the times that we live in. There are people who might have been wonderful shepherds of sheep, of actual sheep, living in nature and staving off predators, but they live in an urban environment and have to do the hustle and bustle of city life. And so, you know, the world has its own realities. We have our own realities. And so trying to figure out where we fit is part of pursuing the truth about vocation and calling.
I love that. How does this idea, how do you see this idea of um, the true, the good, and the beautiful helping people who, I like who live in we're in a generation that it's becoming more and more apparent that it's difficult to kind of leave the home and go out and kind of live your life as a young adult. That a lot of young adults
Mhm.
stay at home for a lot longer period of time now. And sometimes, at least in my experience as a pastor, it seems like there's a lot of pressure, like you were saying, about finding your passion or doing that thing that's going
Mhm.
to kind of bring all sorts of success, and it can kind of stunt someone's growth or stop them from
Mhm.
because of a fear of failure or something. How do you
Mm.
think your thesis about the true, the good, and the beautiful can inform them as they're trying to make
Mm.
their way in the world?
Hmm. That's a really good question. And I just did a workshop at a church where we talked about these things. I talked with the staff and they were mainly young staff. And so we had a lot of talk about the kinds of situations you're describing. And I have seen a lot of criticism or disappointment or misunderstanding on the part of the older generations about the younger generations and the kind of situation that you just described. And again, it goes back to truth. I mean, we judge, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone. We judge what the younger generation should be doing based on the realities or the truths that we grew up in. But
Mm,
if I look at that reality and truth and I realize that my 4 year private liberal arts education was purchased by me with almost nary a student loan dollar because the tuition in those dollars was so low. It hadn't been, it wasn't at the rate of inflation that it is now. I didn't have to go into debt to get an excellent private education. The way that young people are now, that's a reality that they exist in that is not of their making. And all this to say, that's one example of how the world that they are living in is very different economically, socially, for lots of reasons. And so we have to know the reality of that world and then look for the goodness in it. So maybe young people can't buy their own house right now as young of an age. Maybe they have to have family support, but they can still um, face that reality and make decisions based on goals that they might have for a different kind of life. Um, and but we have again, I think it has to do with facing the reality as it is. And if we look across the course of human history, most people have lived in multi-generational homes. They haven't been independent and wealthy by the age of 25. And so life and work life and family life do look different from generation to generation. And we have to face that reality and look for the truth, goodness, and beauty in that for this time.
yeah, that's really helpful. Um, Thinking of truth as like naming reality.
Mm.
Like what is our current reality, not what it was when in 1992 or 1972, whatever year,
Mhm, mhm.
but naming reality today. I think that's really good too, because it helps put some boundaries in place.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes, um, I remember this when I was going to college, and I see it in kids today, this sense of like, what are you going to do in college? Or what are you going to, what major? What are you going to major in? And it can become like this like infinite space of like, oh, I'll look at the website and look at all the majors on the university, and it's like 6,000 majors, or however many. And it can feel like there's no boundaries to this. Like,
Mhm.
how do I name reality in myself as a young person and be like, okay, here are the boundaries I can live within and then move from here. And you talked about this already a little bit about like, what are your own skills, what are your own abilities, and being honest about them. But how does this, yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that for a young person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into the area of not only of truth, but of goodness. Again, a lot of this, I don't want to blame everything on social media, but we're living in this moment where we have so many images put in front of us about what other people do or what life should look like and what expectations should be. And we might see someone else who's really good at something and has achieved good things through that thing and we want to be like that person or we think we should accomplish the same thing and that may not be realistic. We might not be good at that thing. And there's so much competition and a mentality of scarcity rather than abundance, which is something I talk about earlier in the book when I talk about work. And so we can end up, it's just easy to end up having a vision for ourselves that doesn't match the goodness that God created us for because we're looking at what someone else can do. And the literary, to go back, I can't go long without talking about literature. The literary example I use in at one point in the book is Death of a Salesman, the play by Arthur Miller, which has a salesman, he's very much a product of our times, really the mid 20th century. There are things that are different, but things that are the same. And this salesman has pursued an entire vision of the good life that was based on the success of someone from a previous generation that he saw. And he thought that that's how he could gain what he wanted for his life. And it was a total mismatch of his skills, his gifts, abilities, and even his desires. And so he pursued a wrong vision for the good life because it was the only one he had, but it wasn't a good one for him. And so the play is
Mm,
a tragedy. And that's why, because he didn't pursue what was good for his life.
mm. Yeah, what is the good life for you is such an important question to ask oneself because I think we get a vision in our culture wherever we live, and I'm thinking in America of like what a good life looks like, and
Mm-hmm.
so often it's like getting a good degree or a good degree
Mm-hmm.
from a good college, um, getting a good job, going out of college, getting married in like your early 30s and buying a house and this very kind of cookie cutter vision of the good life. But then it's like people get to like 38 or 40 and they're like, I've been just following this path that has
Yes.
nothing really to do with me and
Yes.
doesn't match me, and it's been stressing me out for 15 years. And I think th this idea of, well, what is actually the good life for you is such a more humane and
Mm-hmm.
loving way to approach it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of putting so much pressure of like, I've got to do this, this, and this by 35, or else I've failed in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really loving, kind of compassionate approach.
Mm-hmm.
What did you see? Like, have you seen like in students, like how do people discover that about themselves? Like, what would you say to a student who's really trying to figure out, like, uh, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I don't want to just follow the exact path that
Mm-hmm.
X, Y, and Z has followed. I want to do something that works for me.
Yeah, I love how you described it. I'm still just sort of basking in that. You put it so well. Um, and and we do that, what you just described, sort of these formulas that we think we're supposed to follow. We do that sort of as modern Americans. But we
Hmm.
also do it even more in the church, I think, right? Especially when it comes to what family life must look like or should like in church life. And then as you said, people wake up one day and they're like, "Wait, is this what I was supposed to do all along?" And so I think, of course we have God's will in his word, right? And that's sort of like the big guideline, but it leaves so many other questions unanswered. And I think again, we look at God's word, but we also look at human history. There are so many ways that people have fulfilled their first calling as Christians by being faithful to Christ. And yet they can do that in the towns where they grew up and have lived for generations. They can do that by moving across the country and working in some innovative tech field. They can do that by marrying young, by marrying in mid-age, by never marrying at all, and going on the mission field, not going on the mission field. I mean, when I was growing up, I was so old. I'm so old that when I was growing up, I grew up under that pat cliche of like, if you really love the Lord, you will go into full-time ministry. And I
Oh,
talk about,
yeah.
yeah, right. And so for me, that meant being either a pastor or a missionary. And since I was a girl, I wasn't going to be a pastor, and I had no interest in living in, a third world country. So I just thought that I didn't love the Lord. I mean, I really just thought
Mm.
that. And so I figured I'll do something else, and that was read books. And then I eventually fit the two together. And so I think going back to your question, um, God has put people in our lives that we can who can give us feedback, who can give us wisdom. We need to look to the examples, not the examples on social media, but the examples that are, in the church, faithful people who are doing things in a different way. Perhaps you can look to them. You can ask the people who know you. Oftentimes we don't know what our own gifts and talents are. We think we're good at something that maybe we're not good at, and then someone might name an ability or gift in us that we didn't even know that we had. Those people aren't all the voice of God, but
Mhm.
they can give us perspective about ourselves that we might not have, and to be open, to just to realize first of all what we've just said here, that there is no cookie cutter life for any of us, and that we should feel free to follow the path for the good life, that is one best suited, best fitted to the way that God made us and the way in the time and place that he put us in.
Amen. That's fantastic. I love that. So we've talked about the true, the good. Let's focus a bit on the
Okay.
beautiful,
Okay.
because I think that's a piece that often gets missed.
Hmm.
Um, I think about my upbringing in the church. I don't remember anything about the
Hmm.
beautiful being talked about. In our church that I grew up, there was no real artwork or anything that was like about beauty. And so, what does beauty have to do with work and vocation and calling? What does beauty have to do with it?
Well, that is my favorite part of the book, which is why it's the last part. I saved the best for last. Um, and you're right. We don't talk, especially, if we're coming from a more Protestant tradition, especially, that's covering a wide berth, but still, Protestants in general tend to not focus on beauty as much as the ancients did.
Mhm.
And so we don't focus on beauty in its aesthetic realm very much, let alone on how it might connect to our everyday ordinary lives of work. And so I think there's so many things that could be said about this. What I ended up doing is just looking at, well, first looking at the way that we use beautiful to describe aesthetic experience, which is usually has to do with sensory experience, but also there is a metaphysical kind of beauty that we're talking about when we talk about someone being a beautiful soul or doing a beautiful job or having a beautiful way about them. I mean, we all use the word that way. And so what is it that makes something beautiful in that way? Um, and it is, I think, well, I'm getting ahead. It boils down, I already mentioned this before, it boils down to fittedness. And I'm drawing on Roger Scruton in this part of the book where he talks about beauty being part of beauty being fittedness, like the way that a picture fits into a frame or a door fits into a door jamb or the way that a table setting fits together. And there's an element of that of fittedness, not to get too nerdy here, so bear with me, but there's
Oh, you can get nerdy.
okay,
It's
okay,
totally
okay.
fine.
So fittedness is a very phenomenological thing. Because fittedness requires both, it's like two parts. And so when we're talking about being fit for something, we're talking about ourselves as a sort of subjective thing, and then the objective outer reality that we've already talked about. So what fits, and I draw on the metaphor of clothing in the book.
Mm.
And one of my favorite Twitter accounts, who's this menswear aficionado who constantly tweets about the clothes that look good on public figures and the ones that don't. And he'll always explain why they look good or why they don't look good. And he'll talk about the material or the fabric and the cut and the style and all of these different things that are, even just the way things are, the seamstress works. But over and over, he'll often boil it down to fit. That what looks good on one body doesn't necessarily look good on another body. And that goes back to the vision for the good life that we need to have for our lives. What fits for each of us uniquely is not necessarily going to fit for someone else. And so that's a big part of beauty. And I also draw on Aquinas's famous sort of three components of beauty, which are integrity, proportion, and luminosity. And of course, he's talking about sort of like visual beauty and what makes a painting or a photograph look good or any art. And so we can apply those also to the things that we do in our everyday lives, like whether or not we have integrity or wholeness. And that means, I think, bringing our whole selves to all of our lives, including our work, and proportion, like giving what is due to a task at that time, and not too much, not too little. And if we look at the whole of our lives, that means we may have moments where we have to give more to our families, and then other moments where we have to give more to our work, and that's going to change and shift over the course of our lives. But I'd love to talk about the aspect of luminosity,
Mm.
about bringing illumination and light to the world through our work, no
Mm.
matter what that work is, like making the world a clearer, brighter, better place through whether it's preaching the word or bagging groceries or driving a truck or teaching, whatever it might be. We can bring light and clarity and order to the world through our callings.
That is just so helpful. I think that you concisely just say something here about beauty that I don't think I've heard in many places, this idea of fittedness and bringing your whole self to something. It makes me think of a couple things. One, my late mother-in-law would say, when it comes to clothes, the size doesn't matter. It's all about the fit. And in the sense of like, who cares if it what the letter is for the size? It doesn't matter. What matters is if it fits right and it looks good. And and then the other thing is, it's so often you hear people say things like when they see someone working a job, they'll be like, "Oh, they're the perfect fit for that position,"
Mhm,
or they're
mhm,
or they're not quite a right, they're not quite fitting,
mhm,
you know. And I
mhm,
think that's what it's getting at. You're getting after the sense of like it's got to be a good fit. That's what brings the beauty together. And one example, and you may or may not have experienced this, but I think of Trader Joe's employees. So Trader Joe's hires very particular kinds of people to work
mhm,
in their stores. I don't know all the ins and outs of their hiring process, but I find like when I go to Trader Joe's and I have some groceries, the person that's at the who's the cashier, he or she is always like the most friendly people I've ever met. Like it immediately feels like you're kind of friends with the person and you're like, this seems
mhm,
weird because this is a complete stranger. But it's always like, wow, they're just the right fit for as a Trader Joe's employee. But I've had it at times where I've gone to Trader Joe's and I'm like checking out and I have this interaction. I'm like, wow, that guy didn't
mhm.
fit the Trader Joe's model. Like he wasn't the right
He
fit.
won't he won't last.
No, like I'm like they didn't pick him right. Um,
Hmm.
so thinking about that, like how do I find the right fit for myself? And I think, going back to what you said earlier about trusting people who know you
Hmm.
is so important in this. I think
Hmm.
about um, if I didn't have good people who knew me really well and spoke truth about who I am into me, I I would spend all my time listening to that negative voice in my head that says I can't do anything,
Mhm.
that I'm no good, and that, it's like we all have that voice that is like our enemy in our head. And sometimes that what's been helpful for to me is be like, you know what? So and so said this about me, and I trust that person. I know they know me. I'm gonna act like that's true. I'm gonna live like that's
Yes,
true about
yes, yes.
rather than this voice that's like, oh, you'll
Mhm.
never amount to anything. Um, and uh, and that's just paid off for me so much, just trusting that, okay, I may not feel like I'm quite what they say, but maybe I'll grow into it. Maybe that will become the right fit for me. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. And I think, what you were saying earlier about being a professor, but and no longer being a professor, but always being a teacher. It sounds like, yeah, that's just your fit. How could you
Mhm.
not be?
Mhm.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I didn't start out that way knowing that's what I wanted to do or could do or should do. So
Mhm.
it is a process. And I listened to wise people around me as well and held
Yeah.
it all with an open hand.
Yeah. I love it. Um, I want to just conclude on that idea of wholeness.
Mm,
Eugene Peterson, he talks a lot in his writings about being congruent, like living a congruent life.
mhm,
That throughout his pastoral ministry, he was always trying to figure out, how do I um, cultivate my interior life so that it matches my
mm,
exterior life? How do I live a life of congruence? And as you talk about beauty, that kind of struck me that, like, when you can go out into the world and be like a congruent person who's present in
mm,
whatever vocation that is. Like for me, in my daily life, I have multiple vocations of pastor, of friend, of father, of husband, um, of neighbor. And it's like, how do I show up not with a new mask every time, but with like, this is Travis and this is who I am, and I'm going to be here in this setting now. Um, what would you, how, what are some ways you think that people can cultivate that in their lives?
mm. I do think it needs to be intentional, and it doesn't mean it doesn't mean we bring our entire, personal drama to every situation, but we bring our
No,
entire
yeah.
selves. And
Mhm.
I think, I almost wonder if a lot of the malformation we see on social media today is a result of not doing that. A lot of people, they're one person on social media as opposed to who they are in their real lives, and it just magnifies the modern uh disease we have of not leading these congruent integrated lives. So I think we have to be intentional about it. I think that even our work, so many people don't have the work lives or the vocations perhaps that they find romantic or glamorous or significant in worldly terms, and maybe they are feeling shame about that. There's a lot of talk about elites these days, and there's a root of sort of
Mhm.
bitterness and resentment there. But I think that's because and can be solved perhaps by realizing that we do have these multiple callings, and the thing that we do to put a roof over our heads and put food on the table is a part of our lives, but it's not our whole lives. Our whole lives are how we live in our families and in our neighborhoods and in our workplace and in our churches. And again, I think it's a typically American thing that we do is to put so much emphasis on the work part of it that it distorts everything else. And so maybe it begins with understanding that we're called to all these different roles. They're all vocations, and each one can magnify and feed the other.
Yeah. And it's not a when you look at it like that, it's like it's not about like finding the perfect work-life balance. It sounds like because that phrase always strikes me
Hmm.
as like, oh, how do I, work not too much and spend equal time with my family, and it becomes this like a balancing act.
Hmm.
And but instead it's like, well, what am I actually called to in each of these places, and how
Mhm.
can I show up for that? Um, well, in closing, I want to go to the very beginning of your book. You say on page 3, Jesus is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And you ground the whole book in the person of Jesus Christ, that he is the example of what this looks like, that he found, that he lives out what was just right for him, what was just,
Mhm.
fitting and what was true. Um, and is there a certain story in Jesus's life, or can you say a little bit about kind of examples of like how that's shown in the
Mhm.
story of the Gospels?
Well, since we are talking about vocation and calling and work, I think we have to stop and pause on the fact that Jesus was a carpenter, right? He had a day job, at least for the first 30 years of his life. And 30 years, I mean, so talk about, not launching on his own and in his ministry for a long time. I mean, he gives and shows and demonstrates dignity in everyday ordinary work that supported him in the ministry that he was called to. And so I think that part of his life is important. And then of course so many of the parables have to do with work and seeds and stewardship. His whole life is an example of this congruency and this beauty that we talked about that shows integrity and luminosity and proportion. He really is the way and the truth and the life and what is good, true, and beautiful.
Yeah. I recently heard from Helen Bond. She's a professor at Edinburgh, but she studies Christian origins, and she has this theory, which she doesn't say is like, you know, it she doesn't say this is the absolute truth about Jesus's work as a carpenter, but her hypothesis is that in his work as a carpenter, he was actually a shipbuilder, because the ships there were all wood and all, made of, were all small fishing boats. And then he goes out and he always is around the sea, and that's where he calls his disciples, and they're all fishermen, and he seems to understand what they're doing. And I just heard that recently, and I kind of love that. I was like, oh, like, sometimes you think about the carpenter and you're like, and Jesus was building a chair. But I was like, oh, that gave me a little bit more imagination for the life of Jesus as kind of his like working life. I'm like, oh, and that just put him right on the ground for me. So yeah, I think you're right. Like his daily life, for most of his life, was not out doing miracles. It was living in Nazareth and working with his father and working with his neighbors, and that's a different kind of vision of who Jesus is.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's a great example and model to follow.
Yeah. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This has been such a fun conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. And so by the time this podcast comes out, your book should be out. And I encourage everyone to go grab a copy. It's worth the read. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, like and subscribe and pass it on to a friend. We want more people to know about these great conversations.